For America, the withdrawal from Afghanistan can only be described in 3 words: catastrophic, deadly, and avoidable. Now, despite his efforts to blame everyone else, all responsibility squarely falls on the shoulders of President Joe Biden and his complete lack of a plan. On August 15th, the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, wiping out the hard-fought gains of the last 20 years. But to fully understand how those events unfolded, let's look back at the timeline.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
When Joe Biden was first sworn into office, he promised the American people that while he would make mistakes, he would own up to them.
I'll say I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. When I make them, I'll acknowledge them, and I'll tell you.
President Biden did not keep that promise. In March, newly confirmed Secretary of State Anthony Blinken testified before Congress and said,
"And we boosted diplomatic efforts in Afghanistan ahead of the May 1st deadline."
That seemed to be a step in the right direction, but it soon became clear that diplomatic efforts would not be enough. Soon after, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its annual threat assessment, where they said the Taliban is likely to make gains on the battlefield and the Afghan government will struggle to hold the Taliban at bay if coalition forces withdraw support. Republicans were already sounding the alarm about the situation unfolding in Afghanistan.
I think Joe Biden on foreign policy has been completely incompetent and destabilizing. I knew what was going to happen in Iraq. Afghanistan is going to be worse.
However, just 5 days after the threat assessment was released, President Biden announced the withdrawal of our troops beginning May 1 and ending on September 11.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
This is when it became clear that Biden was not making his decision based on strategic objectives. His decision-making wasn't based on what would make our troops safer or what would make America more secure. It was based on whether or not he could give a big speech on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. Was the administration prepared for it? Take a listen to General McKenzie at the time.
So I am concerned about the ability of the Afghan military to hold on after we leave, the ability of the Afghan Air Force to fly in particular after we remove the support for those aircraft.
10 days after the withdrawal process started, the Taliban captured Nurk district, which is considered to be the gateway to Kabul. Even then, on May 18, the Biden administration's ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, downplayed the Taliban advances in congressional testimony.
If they pursue, in my judgment, a military victory, it will result in a long war, because Afghan security forces will fight, other Afghans will fight, neighbors will come to support the different forces, and they say they want to avoid that.
Later in the same hearing, Khalilzad also said,
I personally believe that the statements that the forces will disintegrate and the Talibs will take over in short order are mistaken.
This arrogance led to a complete lack of preparation. In May, I asked what the Biden administration's plan was to rescue our Afghan allies who served alongside our troops for nearly 2 decades.
Length of time, what efforts are being made to make sure that they're getting their needed letter from HR so that they can go see that chief of station and move on into the next phase of the process?
We will have to get back to you on that.
I would stress that I think all of us would like to see an answer to those specific questions very soon, because the clock is ticking.
The arrogance and ignorance was seen throughout the Biden administration.
And whatever happens in Afghanistan, if there is a significant deterioration in security, that could well happen. We've discussed this before. I don't think it's going to be something that happens from a Friday to a Monday.
The administration was full of empty words, all the way up to President Biden himself. Here's what he had to say during his meeting with Afghan President Ghani.
And Afghans are going to have to decide their future, what they want. But it won't be for lack of us being helped.
Won't be for a lack of help? More empty words from the president, who 7 days later ordered a complete withdrawal from a strategic military base in Afghanistan, Bagram Air Base.
When U.S. troops left, they cut the power. The Afghans, a soldier told me, can't get it working.
How do you feel about the way the Americans left this base?
I don't want to talk about it, he said.
The Americans say that they handed over this base to the Afghans in an orderly way so that they could continue the fight against extremists. they left them a base that the Americans, it looks like they looted themselves.
Remember President Biden's inaugural address when he promised to acknowledge his mistakes? Well, when President Biden was asked about the withdrawal, he said,
That's all on Afghanistan.
I want to talk about happy things, man.
On July 8th, despite rapid Taliban gains in provinces throughout Afghanistan, President Biden then moved the withdrawal date to 11 days earlier than the original date of September 11. It was clear then that the decisions were not being made based on the conditions on the ground.
Our military mission in Afghanistan will conclude on August 31st.
Even though the U.S. wasn't prepared, he began to push for getting out of Afghanistan even earlier, even bragging about the equipment now in the hands of the Afghan military. His analysis of the situation?
The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. We provided our Afghan partners with all the tools, let me emphasize, all the tools, training equipment of any modern military. We provided advanced weaponry.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan.
That got the attention of some in the Biden administration. We had the rare moment of public disagreement. Here's what General McKenzie had to say on al-Qaeda in Afghanistan in public.
Effective CT pressure has made it impossible for al-Qaeda to regenerate and carry out its plans against the West. If that pressure comes off, I believe they're going to regenerate, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see them assert themselves and begin to plan attacks against our homeland.
In the congressional hearing on September 28th, we learned that he'd been saying the same things in private.
I recommended that we maintain 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. I also have a view that the withdrawal of those forces would lead inevitably to the collapse of the Afghan military forces and eventually the Afghan government.
But that's not how President Biden remembered it.
So no one told, your military advisors did not tell you, no, we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that.
No one said that to me that I can recall.
Either he forgot the advice of his generals or he again lied to the American people. Pushback also came from the State Department. Based on reporting, an internal State Department cable warned the administration that the Afghan government would fall. On July 19th, months after the president announced his intention to withdraw, the State Department finally established a task force to evacuate our allies out of Afghanistan. But it's clear now that this was too little too late.
And it is that task force that will coordinate our efforts across the government to take qualified SIV applicants out of harm's way and to bring them to the United States once their security vetting is complete.
Meanwhile, the Taliban has control of over half of Afghanistan districts. It was only a matter of time before they started taking over the provinces. Seeing the situation unfold quickly, what does President Biden do? He made a call to the Afghan President Ghani. But this was not a normal call offering support or resources. President Biden asked his Afghan counterpart to lie, again in the name of optics, and ensure President Biden didn't look like the failure that he was.
And I need not tell you the perception around the world and in parts of Afghanistan, I believe, is that things aren't going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban. And there's a need, whether it is true or not, there is a need to project a different picture.
And finally, on July 30, 3 months after the whole withdrawal process started,
interpreters and others who worked alongside Americans in Afghanistan landed early this morning at Washington Dulles International Airport.
At the same time, the Taliban was making steady advances. Within 1 week, they successfully took over the provincial capital of Nimruz, making it the first of the Afghan provinces to fall into the hands of the Taliban.
We begin, though, tonight with the rapidly deteriorating situation in Afghanistan, the consequences on the ground of President Biden's decision to end 20 years of military presence there by the end of this month.
On August 12, the Pentagon announced 3,000 troops would be sent to Kabul. This was more troops than had been on the ground when President Biden announced the initial timeline. The situation had deteriorated so rapidly that he was having to send thousands of young men and women back in order to clean up his mess.
Those 3 infantry battalions will comprise approximately 3,000 personnel, and they will be in addition to those troops that are already in Kabul as we conduct, as you know, in the process of conducting our drawdown. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But the drawdown itself is still on track to be complete by August 31st.
That makes no sense, John.
I know what you're
putting in 3,000 troops.
I know what you're saying, Lucas.
The next day, the U.S. Embassy began emergency destruction of sensitive documents and material. Remember earlier when President Biden said there would be no images of helicopters airlifting people from the embassy? More empty words.
Right now, U.S. helicopters over Kabul shuttling out American personnel as the Taliban moves into the capital.
And then on August 15,
we're just going to bring you these live and exclusive pictures here. What you are looking at right now is Taliban fighters inside the presidential palace.
Afghans are thronging to Kabul's airport, desperate to get on planes and leave the country at any cost.
Without any resistance, the Taliban took over the capital of Afghanistan.
There's no screening, no security checks, just force of numbers. When they do manage to push aboard planes, they're so crowded, pilots won't take off. And no one agrees to disembark.
And I think those images that you're seeing, and they're seared into all of our minds, speak to this desperation. How desperate, how petrified does an individual have to be to risk everything and just try to physically crush yourself on to the outside of an airplane? Those images of people holding on to a U.S. Air Force carrier.
Asked what would happen if there was any interruption in the plan, President Biden said this.
And the response will be swift and forceful. We will defend our people with devastating force if necessary.
This was another lie. Diplomatic personnel had already been forced out of our embassy. I would call that a pretty big interruption. But then reports soon came out of Kabul that American citizens and green card holders were being whipped at Taliban checkpoints, and others were stranded well outside the perimeter. Republicans voiced concern over what had been unfolding from the situation, and so the House Foreign Affairs Committee Republican members called on President Biden to continue evacuation efforts until everyone is out, even if he did not meet the August 31 deadline that he set for himself. The next day, he lied again, saying this.
And if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
That would have been a tough promise to keep, considering the Biden administration didn't even know who they had to rescue.
Today, how many American citizens remain in Afghanistan?
I don't know.
Americans left behind was not the only problem. Reports broke that millions of dollars, in the words of Joe Biden, all the advanced weaponry of a modern military were being left behind in Afghanistan. House Republicans again demand accountability and an inventory of all surrendered U.S. weaponry.
There's not going to be a repo team that's sent it. When the Pentagon answered what they said about the plan to get those things back, there is no plan. There is no capability to do that. They're not going to go up and say, hey, listen, do you have the title for this Humvee? Do you have the title for this? Right. Did you register this weapon? That's not going to happen. It's in the hands of the Taliban. They're much better equipped for the duration, forever. That's just the simple fact now.
By this time, New York Times reported that at least 250,000 Afghans who worked with the U.S. hadn't been evacuated. And then the nation suffered the most tragic day in Afghanistan in 18 months.
Just got some breaking news. All right, Fox News alert. Back to the big news in Kabul. We are hearing about an explosion that has just taken place at the airport in Kabul.
This is now the deadliest attack on U.S. forces in Afghanistan in more than a decade.
President Biden releasing a statement this afternoon saying, quote, "We will continue to hunt down any person involved in that heinous attack and make them pay."
The ISIS-K suicide bomber killed 13 U.S. service members.
They were killed by the lambs in the White House that allowed themselves to be intimidated.
Weeks later, it was reported that the bomber was a prisoner released from Bagram Air Base, the strategic military base in Afghanistan that the Biden administration abandoned. President Biden enabled this horrific killing of 13 U.S. service members.
This is bound, Kate, to reignite the debate about the U.S. handing over Bagram Air Base. We now understand from this new CNN reporting that Abdul Rahman al-Lughari, the terrorist from ISIS-K who was responsible responsible for killing 13 American service members and dozens of Afghan civilians trying to get out of the country, that he had been held at Parwan prison in Bagram Air Base.
In the next few days, Biden approved retaliatory drone strikes on 2 alleged ISIS-K members, as well as a car supposedly carrying ISIS bombs.
In this strike, they lost a planner and they lost a facilitator, and they've got 1 wounded. And the fact that 2 of these individuals are no longer walking on the face of the earth, that's a good thing. They were ISIS-K planners and facilitators, and that's enough reason they're alone. I won't speak to the details of these individuals or what their specific roles might be.
But later on September 17th, the U.S. military admitted that the August 28 drone strike killed civilians.
Having thoroughly reviewed the findings of the investigation and the supporting analysis by interagency partners, I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, including up to 7 children, were tragically killed in that strike. Our investigation now concludes that the strike was a tragic mistake.
That admission means there still has been no price paid for killing 13 of America's heroes. President Biden had promised swift, forceful, and devastating force, but by now it's become clear that we can't trust anything that man says. On August 29th, the remains of the 13 service members killed in Kabul returned home. And the President of the United States, their commander-in-chief, could not be bothered to give them or their families the respect that they deserve, checking his watch no less than 3 times. 1 day later, on August 30th, the day before the deadline, the United States withdrew all forces from Afghanistan, leaving behind Americans, allies, and our weapons.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans.
The Taliban has made a commitment to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base for external operations that could threaten the United States or our allies, including Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's sworn enemy, ISIS-K.
Probably the most dire thing that I heard him say was this, that the Taliban made a commitment to not allow Afghanistan to become a terrorist safe haven. Let's break that down. The terrorists said they won't allow that country to become a terrorist safe haven. That's makes you wonder about Blinken, our State Department, Biden at every possible level. Meanwhile, in Congress, House Democrats were running interference for their party's failed leader. When Republicans tried to address the situation that had unfolded in Afghanistan, we were met by this.
The House stands adjourned until noon on Friday, September 3rd, 2021.
We try to introduce new legislation today to do whatever is necessary to save our citizens that President Biden left behind in Afghanistan, to make sure that we are not paying ransom to terrorists, to make sure that Congress has a full account of the billions of dollars worth of equipment that we left behind, and to make sure that we are not, as the administration is hinting right now, going to recognize the government, the Taliban government, going forward. And yet, when I asked unanimous consent to do that on the floor a few minutes ago, I was gavelled down.
3 days later, with American weapons left in Afghanistan, the Taliban now better equipped than any point in their history, they held a victory parade. Talk about adding insult to injury.
The Taliban celebrating the spoils of victory with a parade in Kandahar, the city where the group originated. Taliban fighters showing off dozens of American-made armored vehicles and weapons that they seized after Afghan forces fled. This video posted on social media.
For Americans and allies held hostage behind enemy lines, the situation is dire, but is also heartbreaking for the Afghans now living under Taliban rule. Even with America gone, many tried to resist the Sharia law imposed by the new Taliban government, but they were quickly silenced.
Women are worried about going to work. They are constantly under the surveillance where people are watching them over, how they act, how they speak, how they behave, what they wear, how they dress. Their rights are denied to them.
This has been a disaster from start to finish, and yet no one has resigned or was fired for the mishandling in Afghanistan. Instead, Secretary Blinken returned to the House Foreign Affairs Committee to spew more lies.
What you said is dead wrong.
I don't wish
There
to
was
hear
no
your lies.
manipulation of
You've heard your
intelligence,
lies when you step
period.
up in front of the camera
And
and not listen.
We got more of the same when Secretary Austin and General Milley came to Capitol Hill.
Would you use the term extraordinary success for what took place in August in Afghanistan?
That's the non-combatant evacuation, and I think one of the other senators said it very well. It was a logistical success, but a strategic failure.
The Biden administration continues to try and deflect the blame and avoid any and all responsibility. But the American people know what this is and whose fault it is. This was Biden's complete and total diplomatic and strategic failure. At every single turn, he made the wrong decision and managed to make the situation even worse to allow America to be intimidated. And now, 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears were wiped out in 20 days. Joe Biden owns this, and he must resign.